This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome to this exploration of the Tungusic peoples, indigenous communities whose rich history spans the vast forests and frozen tundra of Siberia and Northeast Asia. Today, we'll journey through the fascinating world of these resilient cultures, from the reindeer herders of the taiga to the Manchu dynasty that once ruled China. You'll discover their ancient traditions, unique languages, and the challenges they face in preserving their heritage in the modern world. Join us as we uncover the remarkable story of these often overlooked peoples who have shaped the cultural landscape of Northern Asia for millennia. Chapter 1. From Sushen to Jurchen. When Chinese chroniclers of the Zhou dynasty first recorded encounters with peoples they called the Sushen, they could not have imagined that these forest hunters would be the distant ancestors of a confederation that would one day conquer China itself. The story of the Tungusic peoples stretches across millennia and spans an enormous territory, from the frozen tundra of eastern Siberia to the fertile valleys of Manchuria, encompassing dozens of distinct ethnic groups whose shared linguistic heritage connects them across vast distances and diverse ways of life. The homeland of the Proto-Tungusic peoples remains contested among scholars. Some researchers favor northeastern Manchuria near the Amur River region, while others argue for the Baikal area. Genetic studies from the Olsky district suggest that the Tungusic expansion began before 3500 BC, with Y chromosome haplogroup C2 patterns among Tungusic peoples indicating a migration that would eventually spread these languages across an area larger than Western Europe. As these peoples moved northward into Siberia, they displaced or absorbed speakers of what we now call the Paleo-Siberian languages, creating a linguistic landscape that would remain remarkably stable for thousands of years. The earliest certain historical reference to Tungusic-speaking peoples appears in Chinese records from the Zhou dynasty around 1100 BC, where the Sushen are described as inhabitants of the forests and river valleys that would later be known as Manchuria. These early Sushen lived in what is now divided between China's Heilongjiang province and Russia's Primorsky Krai, a region of dense forests, powerful rivers, and bitter winters. Chinese sources describe them as skilled archers who paid tribute in the form of stone arrow points and furs, particularly the prized sable pelts that would remain a staple of northern trade for millennia to come. What made the Sushen and their descendants distinct was their adaptation to the challenging environment of the north. While Chinese civilization developed around intensive agriculture in the Yellow River Valley, the Sushen perfected techniques for survival in the boreal forests. They hunted elk and wild reindeer, trapped fur-bearing animals, and fished the abundant salmon runs in the region's rivers. Archaeological sites from this period have yielded stone arrow points, fur processing tools, and evidence of both permanent winter settlements and temporary summer camps, confirming the pattern of seasonal migration described in Chinese sources. Copper bells used by shamans, bird-shaped headdresses, and birch bark fishing implements found at these sites reveal a sophisticated material culture adapted to mobility and the forest environment. Around 200 AD, Chinese records begin referring to these northern peoples as the Yilu, though whether this represents a new group or simply a new Chinese term for the same populations remains unclear. The Yilu inhabited a territory that stretched from the northern reaches of the Korean peninsula to the Amur River basin. Chinese chroniclers noted their distinctive customs, including extensive pig farming and their enjoyment of pork, a detail that would distinguish them from many other northern nomadic peoples who favored horse and sheep. The Yilu were also noted for their practice of placing the elderly in trees when they became too old to contribute to the community, a custom that shocked Chinese observers but reflected the harsh realities of life in a marginal environment. The transformation from Yilu to Wuji around 500 AD coincides with a period of political fragmentation in northern China and increased interaction between forest peoples and steppe nomads. The Wuji period, lasting until roughly 700 AD, saw the development of more complex social organization among Tungusic peoples. Chinese sources describe the Wuji as divided into 7 major tribes, each with its own territory and leadership, yet sharing common cultural practices and a degree of mutual intelligibility in language. This period also saw increasing contact with Korean kingdoms to the south and with Mongolic and Turkic peoples to the west, contacts that would profoundly influence Tungusic culture.
The emergence of the Mohe in the 7th century marks a crucial transition in Tungusic history. The Mohe were not a single unified people, but rather a confederation of tribes that included groups speaking different Tungusic dialects and practicing different economies. The Hishui Mohe, or Blackwater Mohe of the northern regions, remained primarily hunters and fishers, following traditional subsistence patterns, while the Sumo Mohe of the southern territories had adopted more settled agricultural practices, growing crops like millet and soybeans alongside their traditional hunting activities. This diversification of economic strategies would become characteristic of Tungusic peoples, who showed remarkable flexibility in adapting their lifestyles to local conditions. The relationship between the Mohe and the Tang dynasty of China illustrates the complex dynamics that would characterize Tungusic Chinese relations for centuries. The Mohe were simultaneously tributaries of the Tang, trading partners, military allies, and occasional enemies. When the kingdom of Balhae was established in the late 7th century in what is now northeastern China and the Russian Far East, it represented a synthesis of Tungusic Mohe culture with Chinese administrative practices and Buddhist religion. Balhae lasted for 2 centuries as a sophisticated state that mediated between Chinese civilization and the Tungusic peoples of the north, though it would ultimately fall to the Khitan Liao dynasty in 926. During this long period from the Sushen through the Mohe, the fundamental patterns of Tungusic life became established. In the northern forests, groups like the ancestors of the modern Evenki and Evan remained mobile reindeer herders and hunters, following their herds through seasonal migrations that could cover hundreds of miles. They developed the conical tent dwelling constructed from poles covered with birch bark or hide, a structure that could be quickly assembled and disassembled as needed. Their shamanic religious practices, based on communication with spirits of nature and ancestors, would prove remarkably persistent even as other aspects of culture changed. Further south, along the Amur River and its tributaries, other Tungusic groups developed a different pattern of life. The ancestors of the Nanai, Ulchi, and Udeje became settled fishermen, building permanent villages along riverbanks where they could take advantage of the enormous salmon runs. They developed sophisticated fishing technologies, including elaborate fish traps constructed from wooden stakes and woven willow branches that could catch hundreds of salmon during spawning season. Their distinctive birch bark boats, lightweight yet durable, could navigate shallow streams and portage between waterways. Their houses were semi-subterranean structures with wooden frames covered by earth, designed to retain heat during the brutal winters through their heat-absorbing design, and they developed techniques for preserving fish through drying and smoking that allowed them to accumulate winter stores.
The diversity among Tungusic peoples extended to social organization as well. Most groups were organized into clans with patrilineal descent, though the specific rules governing marriage, inheritance, and political authority varied considerably. The concept of the Hala, an exogamous patrilineal clan, appears across many Tungusic societies. Shamans held important religious and healing roles, but political leadership was typically separate, held by clan elders or, in some cases, individuals who had gained prestige through success in hunting or warfare. The emergence of the Jurchen in the 10th century represents the next major chapter in Tungusic history and would lead directly to the establishment of the Jin dynasty. The Jurchen were descendants of the Mohe, particularly the He-Shui Mohe, who had remained in the forests of what is now Manchuria. Chinese sources from the Liao dynasty period describe the Jurchen as divided into multiple groups, with different levels of integration into the Chinese cultural sphere. The civilized Jurchen had adopted many Chinese practices, including agriculture and a degree of literacy in Chinese, while the wild Jurchen remained primarily hunters and gatherers in the deep forests.
What united the disparate Jurchen tribes was a combination of shared language, common cultural practices, and growing pressure from the Khitan Lao dynasty that ruled much of northern China and Mongolia. The Lao had established a system of tribute and control over the Jurchen, but this system contained the seeds of its own destruction. The Lao practice of demanding that Jurchen families provide women for Khitan envoys, particularly when this extended from unmarried women to married aristocratic women, created deep resentment among Jurchen elites and contributed to growing anti-Lao sentiment that would eventually fuel rebellion. This resentment, combined with the military and organizational genius of the Jurchen leader Wanyan Aguda, would transform the fragmented Jurchen tribes into a formidable military power. Aguda, whose name means righteous, came from a prominent Jurchen clan that had already achieved a degree of prominence under Lao rule. In 1115, he led a successful revolt against the Lao, and within a decade, the Jurchen had not only overthrown their former masters, but had conquered much of northern China, establishing the Jin dynasty that would rule for over a century. The Jurchen conquest reveals the military capabilities that Tungusic peoples could develop when organized under effective leadership. Jurchen warriors combined the mobility and archery skills developed through generations of hunting with sophisticated iron weapons and armor. They were expert horsemen who could execute complex tactical maneuvers, and they adapted siege technologies from Chinese and Khitan sources to overcome fortified cities. The Jurchen army that defeated the Lao and later the Song was a formidable force that shocked the Chinese world.
As the Jurchen rulers settled into governing a predominantly Chinese population, they began adopting Chinese administrative practices and Confucian ideology, a pattern that would repeat with even greater consequence under the later Qing dynasty. The invention of the Jurchen script in 1119, based on the Khitan script with the addition of many Chinese characters, represents an attempt to maintain a distinct Jurchen cultural identity. The Jurchen script was used on official stelae and monuments, several of which survive today in Manchuria and Korea. The most important of these is the Yongning Temple stele, erected in 1185, which provides valuable evidence of the Jurchen language at its height. This script would fall out of use as the Jin dynasty declined, but it established a precedent for creating writing systems for Tungusic languages that would be revived by the Manchus centuries later. The Jin dynasty fell to the Mongol invasion in 1234, and the Jurchen were scattered and fragmented. Many were absorbed into Mongol military units, while others retreated to the forests and mountains of Manchuria, reverting to their traditional hunting and fishing economies. Chinese sources from the Ming dynasty, which succeeded the Mongols, refer to these descendants of the Jurchen as Nuzhen, distinguishing them into categories based on their level of integration into Chinese culture. The civilized Jurchen lived near Chinese settlements and engaged in trade and agriculture, while the wild Jurchen remained in the deep forests, largely beyond the reach of Chinese authority.
This period of fragmentation, from the fall of the Jin in the 13th century to the rise of the Manchu in the 16th century, saw the Tungusic peoples of Manchuria organized into numerous small groups, each with its own territory and leadership. The Ming dynasty attempted to control these groups through a system of hereditary offices and trade privileges, appointing Jurchen leaders as commanders of military units and guardians of the frontier. This system of indirect rule allowed the Ming to maintain a presence in Manchuria without the expense of direct administration, but it also created competition among Jurchen leaders for access to Chinese titles and trade goods, setting the stage for the next great transformation.
Throughout this long history, from the ancient Sushen through the Jin dynasty and beyond, certain fundamental aspects of Tungusic culture remained remarkably persistent. The boreal forest and the major river systems of northeastern Asia shaped a way of life based on seasonal movement, hunting, and fishing. Family and clan remained the basic units of social organization, with shamanic practices providing the primary framework for understanding the spiritual world. Even as some Tungusic groups became settled agriculturalists or powerful conquerors of Chinese territory, they maintained cultural memories and practices that connected them to their origins in the forests and rivers of the north. This long evolution from Sushen to Jurchen, spanning nearly 3,000 years, had produced a constellation of related but distinct peoples united by language family, yet divided by geography, economy, and historical experience. A diversity that would prove both strength and weakness as some Tungusic groups rose to imperial power, while others struggled to maintain their cultural identity in the face of more powerful neighbors. Chapter 2. From 13 Warriors to Empire. In the winter of 1583, a young Jurchen warrior named Narration stood amid the ruins of his family compound, mourning his father and grandfather who had just been killed in a raid by a rival Jurchen faction backed by Ming Chinese officials. At 25 years old, he possessed nothing but his armor, 13 warriors loyal to his clan, and a burning determination to avenge his family and unify the fractured Jurchen tribes. Nobody could have predicted that this moment of personal tragedy would set in motion a transformation that would produce the Qing dynasty, the last and one of the most successful imperial dynasties to rule China. The Jurchen people Narration inherited were a far cry from their ancestors who had conquered northern China under the Jin dynasty 4 centuries earlier. The Ming dynasty had deliberately kept them divided, playing one Jurchen faction against another through a system of titles, trade privileges, and military appointments. The Ming classified the Jurchen into 3 broad categories based on their proximity to Chinese civilization and their degree of integration into Chinese trading networks. The Jianzhou Jurchen, Narhachi's people, lived closest to the Ming border in the area around what is now Liaoning province. They engaged in both agriculture and hunting, traded regularly with Chinese merchants, and some could even read and write Chinese. The High-Sea Jurchen lived further north, organized into several populous tribes that combined horse breeding learned from Mongol neighbors with seasonal farming. Finally, the Wild Jurchen, whom the Chinese called Yeren, inhabited the remote forests beyond the Liao and Songhua river valleys, living primarily by hunting and fishing with minimal contact with Chinese authority. Narration began his rise to power by leveraging the very system that had kept the Jurchen divided. He cultivated relationships with Ming officials, receiving the hereditary title of commander and permission to establish trading posts. The revenue from the lucrative fur trade, particularly in sable pelts that commanded enormous prices in Chinese markets, provided him with the resources to expand his military following. But Narration was not content to remain a Ming vassal. Between 1583 and 1616, he systematically conquered and absorbed neighboring Jurchen tribes, employing a combination of military force, strategic marriages that bound rival clans to his growing confederation, and shrewd diplomacy. When a tribe resisted, he could be ruthlessly effective in battle. When they submitted peacefully, he incorporated them into his growing confederation, often giving their leaders positions of authority in his administration. The key to Narhachi's success lay not just in military conquest, but in his genius for organization and his creation of an entirely new social and military structure known as the 8 Banners. Beginning in 1615, Narration reorganized Jurchen society from its traditional clan-based system into administrative and military units called banners. Each banner was identified by a distinctive colored flag. Originally 4 banners in plain yellow, white, blue, and red, later expanded to 8 by adding bordered versions of each color. Every Jurchen man was registered under one of these banners, which served simultaneously as his military unit, his administrative district, and his source of land and livelihood. When a tribe resisted, he could be ruthlessly effective in battle. When they submitted peacefully, he incorporated them into his growing confederation, often giving their leaders positions of authority in his administration.
The key to Nurhaci's success lay not just in military conquest, but in his genius for organization and his creation of an entirely new social and military structure known as the Eight Banners. Beginning in 1615, Nurhaci reorganized Jurchen society from its traditional clan-based system into administrative and military units called banners. Each banner was identified by a distinctive colored flag. Originally 4 banners in plain yellow, white, blue, and red, later expanded to 8 by adding bordered versions of each color. Every Jurchen man was registered under one of these banners, which served simultaneously as his military unit, his administrative district, and his source of land and livelihood. The brilliance of the banner system was that it transcended the old clan divisions that had kept the Jurchen fragmented for generations. A banner company might include men from half a dozen different clans, all bound together by their loyalty to Nurhaci and their banner lord, rather than to traditional kinship structures. Nurhaci assigned land to each banner and expected the men to farm during peacetime while remaining ready for military service. The banners also incorporated conquered peoples. As Nurhaci expanded his territory, he created Mongol banners and later Chinese banners, integrating these populations into his military and administrative system while keeping them segregated from the Jurchen banners. In 1616, Nurhaci took the decisive step of declaring himself Khan and establishing the later Jin dynasty, explicitly claiming descent from the Jurchen Jin dynasty that had ruled northern China 5 centuries earlier. This was both a symbolic break from Ming vassalage and a statement of ambition. Nurhaci was no longer merely a successful war leader or a Ming-appointed commander. He now claimed the mandate to rule as an independent sovereign. The early years of the later Jin were marked by constant warfare with the Ming dynasty. Nurhaci proved himself a master of siege warfare and mobile cavalry operations. In 1618, he captured the strategic city of Sushen, and in 1621 he won a stunning victory at the Battle of Sarhu, where his forces destroyed a Ming army 4 times their size through superior tactics and coordination. Yet Nurhaci understood that military success alone would not sustain his nascent state. He commissioned the creation of a new writing system for the Jurchen language, based on the Mongolian alphabet, but modified to represent Jurchen phonology more accurately. The Manchu script, as it came to be known, allowed Nurhaci to conduct administration in the Jurchen language, while also facilitating the translation of Chinese texts on governance, military strategy, and law. Nurhaci ordered the translation of Chinese classics and legal codes, creating a corpus of written material that would educate his people in the arts of statecraft while maintaining their distinct linguistic identity. When Nurhaci died in 1626 from wounds sustained in battle, his son Hong Taiji succeeded him and took Nurhaci's project to its next stage. Hong Taiji was, if anything, even more ambitious and sophisticated than his father. He understood that to conquer China, the Jurchen needed to present themselves not as barbarian raiders, but as a legitimate alternative to the Ming dynasty, capable of ruling the diverse peoples of Inner Asia and China proper. In 1635, Hong Taiji took a step that would prove crucial to this vision. He abolished the name Jurchen entirely and decreed that his people would henceforth be called Manchu. The proclamation that established this new identity was explicit in its reasoning. Hong Taiji declared that the old term Jurchen was associated with being subjects of past dynasties and carried demeaning connotations. The new name Manchu was presented as the original, pure name of the people, though its actual etymology remains somewhat mysterious. What mattered was that Manchu represented a clean break from the past and the creation of a new identity that could incorporate not just the various Jurchen tribes, but also Mongols, Chinese, and other peoples who joined the expanding state. This was not merely a rebranding exercise, but a fundamental reimagining of who the Manchu people were and what they were building.
Hong Taiji continued expanding the banner system, formally creating Mongol and Chinese banners that stood equal in status to the original Manchu banners. He attracted Mongol allies by portraying himself as a universal ruler in the Mongol tradition, even claiming descent from Genghis Khan through his Mongol grandmother. Chinese officials who defected from the Ming were given positions of responsibility, and their troops incorporated into Chinese banners. By the time Hong Taiji died in 1643, he had created a multi-ethnic army and administration in which Manchus provided the core military strength, but Mongols and Chinese held crucial positions in governance and warfare.
The conquest of China itself, when it came, owed as much to Ming collapse as to Manchu strength. Hong Taiji's death had left his young son as heir, with Prince Dorgan serving as regent to guide the child who would become the Shunzi emperor. The Ming dynasty in the 1640s was a state in terminal crisis, racked by peasant rebellions, fiscal bankruptcy, and factional paralysis at court. In 1644, a rebel leader named Li Zicheng captured Beijing, and the last Ming emperor hanged himself on a hill behind the Forbidden City. At this moment of dynastic collapse, a Ming general named Wu Songui made a decision that would change Chinese history. Faced with the choice between submitting to the rebel Li Zicheng or inviting the Manchu to help restore order, Wu chose the Manchu. He opened the gates of the strategic Shanhai Pass and allowed Manchu armies to enter China proper. The Manchu forces, led by the regent Dorgan, in the name of the young Shunzi emperor, moved swiftly to occupy Beijing and defeat Li Zicheng's rebel army. They then proclaimed the establishment of the Qing dynasty, presenting themselves not as foreign conquerors, but as the saviors of Chinese civilization from chaos and rebellion. This framing would prove central to their rule. The Qing positioned themselves as legitimate holders of the mandate of heaven, who had arrived to restore order and proper governance after the Ming's failure.
The conquest of all of China would take decades. Ming loyalists resisted in the south, and it was not until 1683 that the last Ming holdout, the Kingdom of Tungning on Taiwan, was subdued. But the Qing approach to conquest was sophisticated and often remarkably successful at winning over former Ming subjects. Chinese officials who surrendered were typically allowed to keep their positions or given new appointments. The Qing maintained the Ming administrative structure largely intact, including the examination system that selected officials based on mastery of Confucian classics. Chinese scholars who passed the examinations could rise to high office in the Qing bureaucracy, and the dynasty made efforts to patronize Chinese literary culture and portray its emperors as cultivated Confucian monarchs. Yet the Qing never forgot that they were conquest rulers, and they implemented policies designed to maintain Manchu identity and military prowess even as they adopted Chinese governance practices. The most visible symbol of this was the queue, the hairstyle that required Chinese men to shave the front of their heads and wear their remaining hair in a long braid. This was a Manchu style, and forcing Chinese men to adopt it served as a constant reminder of who ruled. Resistance to the queue requirement sparked rebellions and massacres in the early years of conquest, as the Qing ruthlessly suppressed those who refused to comply. The slogan, "Keep your head and lose your head," or "Keep your head and lose your hair," reflected the deadly seriousness with which the Qing enforced this regulation. The Qing also maintained strict segregation in certain spheres. Manchu bannermen and their families were forbidden from engaging in trade or manual labor, and were instead supported by stipends and land grants. They lived in separate quarters in major cities, most notably the Tartar city in Beijing, which was reserved exclusively for bannermen and their dependents. Intermarriage between Manchus and Han Chinese was prohibited, at least officially, though this rule was often violated in practice. The Qing court conducted much of its business in both Manchu and Chinese, with important documents produced in both languages, and the dynasty made efforts to preserve and promote Manchu language and culture among the banner population. The military organization of the Qing reflected this same concern with maintaining Manchu distinctiveness. The banner forces remained the core of the Qing military establishment, with Manchu banners holding the most prestigious positions and receiving the best equipment and training. Banner garrisons were stationed at strategic points throughout the empire, serving both as a military reserve and as visible symbols of Qing power. At the same time, the Qing also maintained large Chinese armies known as the Green Standard Forces, which did much of the routine work of local security and frontier defense.
The height of Qing power came during the reigns of the Kangxi, Yangzheng, and Qianlong emperors from 1662 to 1796. These three rulers presided over an era of territorial expansion, economic prosperity, and cultural flourishing that has been called the High Qing. The Kangxi emperor, who came to the throne as a child and ruled for 61 years, consolidated Qing control over China proper, crushed the rebellion of the three feudatories, conquered Taiwan, and defeated the Mongol Dzungar Khanate. His grandson, the Qianlong Emperor, pushed Qing borders to their greatest extent, incorporating Xinjiang, Tibet, and parts of Central Asia into the empire. At its height, the Qing Empire was one of the largest and most populous states in the world, ruling over perhaps 300 million people across an area that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Pamir Mountains. Chapter 3. The Conquest that Conquered the Conquerors. In 1705, the Kangxi Emperor issued one of his periodic edicts commanding all Manchu bannermen to maintain their ancestral language and practice the skills of archery and horsemanship that had made their forefathers masters of Asia. The very existence of such an edict revealed a troubling truth that the emperor could not ignore. The Manchu people were forgetting who they were. In the drawing rooms of Beijing, Manchu nobles conversed in Chinese. In the examination halls, Manchu students struggled to read documents in their ancestral script. On the training grounds, young bannermen from comfortable families proved unable to draw the powerful composite bows their grandfathers had wielded with deadly skill. The conquerors were becoming indistinguishable from the conquered, and no amount of imperial decrees seemed capable of stopping this transformation. This was the central paradox of Manchu power. The very mechanisms that allowed the Manchus to rule successfully over China with such stability and longevity were the same forces that dissolved their distinct identity. Every Chinese official they employed, every Confucian text they mastered, every Chinese custom they adopted to legitimize their rule pulled them further from their origins in the forests and rivers of Manchuria. By the time the Qing dynasty fell in 1912, the Manchus had achieved something extraordinary. They had ruled the world's most populous empire for nearly 3 centuries. Yet, in doing so, they had largely ceased to exist as a culturally and linguistically distinct people.
The Manchu language provides the clearest marker of this cultural transformation. In the early Qing period, the dynasty conducted official business in both Manchu and Chinese, with important edicts and documents produced in both languages. Manchu was the language of the conquest elite, the medium through which military orders were given and confidential court business discussed. But Chinese was the language of the vast bureaucracy that actually governed the empire, the language in which the classical texts were written, and the language spoken by the overwhelming majority of subjects. The demographic reality was stark. Ruling over a population that outnumbered them by more than 100 to 1, Manchus quickly realized that fluency in Chinese was far more useful than fluency in Manchu for advancing their careers and navigating society. By the mid-18th century, the Qianlong Emperor, who reigned from 1736 to 1795, was confronting the reality that many Manchus in Beijing could no longer speak or read their ancestral language. The emperor himself was thoroughly bilingual and culturally Chinese in many respects. He wrote tens of thousands of poems in Chinese, collected Chinese art and calligraphy on an unprecedented scale, and styled himself as a universal monarch versed in both Chinese and Inner Asian traditions.
Yet he also recognized the danger that complete assimilation posed to Manchu identity and political control.
The Qianlong Emperor's response was to order the compilation of comprehensive Manchu language dictionaries and the translation of major Chinese literary works into Manchu. He commanded that all official documents continue to be produced in both languages, and that Manchu boys receive education in their ancestral tongue. He also commissioned historical works that celebrated Manchu military achievements and emphasized the distinct origins and customs of the Manchu people. These were the actions of a ruler who understood that cultural distinctiveness was slipping away, but who believed that imperial authority could halt or reverse this process. The reality on the ground told a different story. In the banner garrisons scattered across China, Manchu families lived in separate quarters from the Chinese population, supported by government stipends and forbidden from engaging in trade or agriculture. This system was designed to maintain a distinct military caste always ready for war, but it had the opposite effect. Removed from the harsh realities that had forged their ancestors into formidable warriors, living comfortably on government support in the heart of Chinese cities, young Manchus had little incentive to maintain traditional skills. Learning Chinese, adopting Chinese customs, and participating in Chinese cultural life offered far more opportunities and pleasures than practicing archery in the military drill grounds.
The geographic distribution of Manchu populations created different trajectories of assimilation. In Beijing and other major cities of China proper, Manchus lived in close daily contact with Chinese culture and rapidly adopted Chinese language and customs. Many spoke Chinese more fluently than Manchu within 2 or 3 generations of the conquest. The cosmopolitan environment of the capital, with its theaters, tea houses, and literary salons, proved irresistible to Manchu youth who had grown up in privilege and comfort. In Manchuria itself, the situation was more complex, but the outcome ultimately similar. The Qing initially attempted to preserve Manchuria as a Manchu homeland by restricting Han Chinese migration to the region, designating vast areas as imperial hunting grounds and military training areas where Han settlement was forbidden. However, this policy proved impossible to maintain in practice. Chinese farmers gradually moved into Manchuria, drawn by fertile land and economic opportunities. By the 19th century, they vastly outnumbered the Manchu population in their own homeland. Even in Manchuria, Manchus found themselves surrounded by Chinese speakers and Chinese culture, and the same pressures toward assimilation operated with similar force. The Sibe people provide a fascinating counterpoint to this general pattern of language loss. The Sibe were ethnically and linguistically Manchus who had been relocated to the remote Ili Valley in Xinjiang in the 18th century as part of a Qing military garrison. Removed from the intense Sinicizing pressures of China proper and Manchuria, the Sibe maintained their language far more successfully than their cousins in Beijing or the Northeast. Living among Kazakh, Uyghur, and other Turkic peoples rather than being submerged in Han Chinese culture, the Sibe communities preserved a form of Manchu that remained intelligible with the classical written language. This preservation occurred not because the Sibe were isolated from all outside influence, but because they were removed from the overwhelming dominance of Han Chinese culture. Their experience demonstrated that the loss of Manchu language and identity was not inevitable, but rather a consequence of specific conditions that prevailed in most Manchu communities.
The education system established by the Qing for Manchu bannermen inadvertently accelerated Sinicization. The dynasty created banner schools where Manchu children were supposed to learn their ancestral language and practice martial skills. But increasingly, these schools also taught Chinese classics, and success in the Chinese examination system offered the path to prestigious positions in the bureaucracy. A Manchu youth who excelled in Chinese learning and passed the examinations could become a provincial governor or a high-ranking official at court. A Manchu youth who excelled only in archery and horsemanship might spend his life in a provincial garrison with little prospect of advancement. The incentive structure overwhelmingly favored Chinese learning over Manchu traditions.
The examination system itself created a pipeline that drew talented young Manchus away from their martial heritage and into the world of Chinese scholarship. Preparing for the examinations required years of intensive study of Confucian classics, Chinese history, and classical Chinese poetry. Students had to memorize vast quantities of text, learn to write in the elaborate literary styles expected of scholars, and absorb the philosophical and ethical frameworks of Confucian thought. This education was conducted almost entirely in Chinese and through Chinese texts. A Manchu youth who succeeded in this system emerged as much a Chinese scholar as a Manchu warrior, his mind shaped by centuries of Chinese intellectual tradition.
Cultural practices beyond language showed similar patterns of transformation. In the early Conquest period, Manchus maintained distinct customs in dress, hairstyle, housing, and food. Women did not bind their feet as Chinese women did. Men wore their distinctive queue and the high-collared robes that would later come to be called Mandarin style in the West. Manchu families ate foods that reflected their northern origins, including dishes featuring venison and wild game, and they maintained ceremonial practices tied to shamanic traditions from the forests of Manchuria. Over time, these distinctions blurred and often disappeared entirely. Manchu women in Beijing began adopting Chinese clothing styles and jewelry, though they continued to avoid foot binding, which remained a clear marker of ethnic difference. Manchu families built houses that increasingly resembled Chinese compounds in layout and decoration. Manchu cuisine incorporated Chinese cooking techniques and ingredients, and the distinction between Manchu and Chinese food became difficult to discern for all but a few specialized dishes served on ceremonial occasions. Even shamanic religious practices, which had been central to Manchu spiritual life, were gradually supplemented or replaced by Chinese Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucian ancestor worship. Manchu families might maintain ancestral tablets and perform sacrifices according to Confucian ritual, while abandoning the shamanic ceremonies their grandparents had considered essential. Even shamanic religious practices, which had been central to Manchu spiritual life, were gradually supplemented or replaced by Chinese Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucian ancestor worship. Manchu families might maintain ancestral tablets and perform sacrifices according to Confucian ritual, while abandoning the shamanic ceremonies their grandparents had considered essential. The Qing imperial clan itself exemplified this cultural transformation. Emperors from Kangxi onwards were thoroughly educated in Chinese classics and became accomplished Chinese scholars and artists. They patronized Chinese literary culture, commissioned vast scholarly projects like the compilation of the complete library of the four treasuries, and portrayed themselves as defenders and promoters of Chinese civilization. The elaborate court rituals that regulated life in the Forbidden City drew heavily on Chinese precedent, even when they incorporated inner Asian elements. The emperors spoke Chinese with their officials, wrote poetry in Chinese, and thought about governance through frameworks derived from Chinese philosophy. Yet the Qing emperors also tried to maintain their Manchu identity in certain ritual and symbolic contexts. They continued to perform sacrifices to Manchu ancestral deities in the Kuning Palace, maintained the distinction between inner and outer courts that reflected Manchu and Chinese spheres, and insisted on the use of Manchu for certain military and ceremonial purposes. Imperial hunts in Manchuria, conducted with great ceremony and elaborate ritual, were intended to preserve martial traditions and remind bannermen of their warrior heritage. This dual identity, simultaneously Manchu emperors preserving their distinct heritage and Chinese emperors embodying Confucian ideals, created enormous tension. Emperors could maintain this balance through force of personality and imperial authority, but ordinary Manchus lacked such resources and faced overwhelming pressure to choose Chinese culture over Manchu traditions.
The situation of intermarriage illustrates the gap between official policy and social reality. The Qing officially prohibited marriage between Manchus and Han Chinese, attempting to maintain clear ethnic boundaries through legal regulation. Yet these prohibitions were violated regularly, especially in areas where Manchus and Chinese lived in close proximity.
Chinese women were taken as concubines by Manchu bannermen despite official rules. Manchu women married Chinese men despite official disapproval. Over generations, the genetic and cultural boundaries between Manchus and Han Chinese became increasingly porous, despite the legal fiction of separation. Children of these unions faced complex questions of identity and registration, and the practical reality was that families with mixed ancestry often navigated the system pragmatically, registering children in whatever category offered the most advantages. Class differences among Manchus created distinct experiences of sinicization. The imperial clan and high-ranking banner nobles could afford to maintain certain Manchu cultural practices as markers of elite status. They employed tutors to teach their children both Manchu and Chinese, maintained hunting skills through participation in imperial hunts, and surrounded themselves with Chinese and Manchu advisors who could help them navigate both cultural spheres. These elite Manchus might be thoroughly sinicized in their intellectual life while maintaining a thin veneer of Manchu cultural practice in specific ceremonial contexts.
Common bannermen, by contrast, often lost their Manchu cultural heritage more completely. Living on fixed stipends that gradually lost value through inflation, unable to engage in trade or other economic activities, many banner families fell into poverty and social dysfunction. Their children attended banner schools that taught Chinese classics while offering only perfunctory Manchu language instruction. Without the resources to hire private tutors or maintain elaborate cultural practices, these families simply adopted Chinese language and customs wholesale, finding no practical benefit in preserving Manchu traditions that the broader society did not value. The 18th and 19th centuries saw a gradual but unmistakable shift in what it meant to be Manchu. In the early Qing, being Manchu meant speaking the Manchu language, following Manchu customs, and maintaining a martial identity distinct from Chinese scholar gentry culture. By the mid-19th century, being Manchu increasingly meant having Manchu ancestry and being registered in a banner, regardless of whether one spoke Manchu or followed Manchu customs. The ethnic category persisted and continued to carry certain legal privileges and obligations, but the cultural content of Manchu identity had largely evaporated for the majority of the banner population. When the Qing dynasty collapsed in 1912, it removed the institutional supports that had sustained even this nominal distinction between Manchus and Han Chinese. The banner system was abolished, ending the stipends and privileged status that Manchu families had enjoyed for centuries. The new Republic of China, founded on nationalist principles that emphasized Chinese identity, had little patience for ethnic distinctions that reminded Chinese of their subjugation by foreign conquerors. Manchus faced discrimination and even violence, blamed for the dynasty's failures and humiliations at the hands of foreign powers. Many Manchus responded to this hostile environment by hiding or downplaying their identity. They changed their surnames to sound more Chinese, destroyed clan records that marked them as Manchus, and avoided speaking about their ancestry. In Beijing, Manchu neighborhoods that had been exclusively bannerman quarters were open to the general population, and Manchus mixed with Chinese residents. The cultural practices that had distinguished Manchus, what remained of them after 2.5 centuries of sinicization, were quietly abandoned as dangerous markers of a discredited past. The paradox of Manchu power reached its ultimate conclusion. A people who successfully conquered and ruled the world's most populous empire for nearly 3 centuries had, by the very act of ruling, dissolved into that population. The Manchus who stood outside Beijing's gates in 1644 could not have imagined this outcome. They saw themselves as a distinct people with a proud martial tradition, poised to rule but never to disappear. Yet disappear they did, not through defeat in battle or forced assimilation by conquerors, but through the inexorable logic of their own success. Every mechanism they employed to govern effectively pulled them toward Chinese culture. They needed Chinese officials to administer the empire, which meant adopting Chinese bureaucratic practices.
They needed legitimacy in Chinese eyes, which meant mastering Confucian learning and portraying themselves as proper Chinese emperors. They needed to educate their children for success, which meant emphasizing Chinese language and literature over Manchu traditions. Each generation of Manchus who grew up under these conditions became a little more Chinese and a little less Manchu, until the cultural distance between conqueror and conquered had disappeared almost entirely. Every mechanism they employed to govern effectively pulled them toward Chinese culture. They needed Chinese officials to administer the empire, which meant adopting Chinese bureaucratic practices. They needed legitimacy in Chinese eyes, which meant mastering Confucian learning and portraying themselves as proper Chinese emperors. They needed to educate their children for success, which meant emphasizing Chinese language and literature over Manchu traditions. Each generation of Manchus who grew up under these conditions became a little more Chinese and a little less Manchu, until the cultural distance between conqueror and conquered had disappeared almost entirely.
The Qing dynasty's fall in 1912 marked the formal end of Manchu political dominance, but the cultural transformation it represented had occurred decades or even centuries earlier. The Manchus had not been conquered by the Chinese in battle. They had been absorbed by Chinese civilization through the very process of ruling it, pulled by 1,000 daily choices and incentives toward assimilation, until their distinct identity existed more in legal categories and fading memories than in lived cultural practice. The price of conquest, it turned out, was the conquerors themselves.
Chapter 4. The Last Speakers. In August 1992, the linguist Toshiro Tsumogari traveled to a small village called Raohei along the Ussuri River in China's Heilongjiang province, hoping to record speakers of Hezhen, the Chinese name for the Nanai language. What he found shocked him, even though he had come prepared for bad news. The village elders who could still speak Hezhen fluently were all in their 70s or 80s. Their children understood some words, but could not carry on a conversation. Their grandchildren knew nothing at all. When Tsumogari asked one elderly woman to tell a traditional story in Hezhen, she had to pause repeatedly to find words she had not used in decades, her mind reaching back to a language that had almost no place in her daily life anymore. The story she told him that day, a tale of two serpent siblings, flowed in a mixture of Hezhen and Chinese. Chinese words for modern concepts interrupted the Hezhen narrative. The grammatical structures showed Chinese influence in places where the closely related Nanai language, spoken across the border in Russia, would have used different constructions. Yet, even in this degraded form, the story preserved something precious, a window into a way of thinking about the world that was disappearing in real time. Tsumogari recorded the story carefully, knowing that the woman telling it might be among the last people on Earth capable of producing even this imperfect version of Hezhen speech.
The crisis facing Hezhen was not unique but representative of a catastrophe unfolding across the entire Tungusic language family. When linguists compiled estimates of Tungusic language speakers in the late 1980s and early 2000s, the numbers told a story of imminent extinction. The Hezhen people numbered over 4,000, but perhaps only 40 individuals could still speak the language. The Oroken maintained barely 2,000 speakers. Even languages with somewhat better numbers showed precipitous decline across generations. Soviet census data from the 20th century documented this collapse with bureaucratic precision. The percentage of each Tungusic ethnic group that claimed their ancestral language as their mother tongue fell dramatically between 1959 and 1989. The Evenki dropped from 55% to just over 30%. The Even plummeted from 81% to 44%. The Nanai declined from 86% to 44%. The Udege crashed from 74% to 26%. The Oroki, one of the smallest groups, fell from 68% to less than 19%. These dry statistics documented the death of languages that had been spoken for thousands of years. What had caused this catastrophe?
The answer lay in 20th century policies that treated minority languages as obstacles to modernization. In the Soviet Union, Russian became the language of education, government, media, and advancement. Speaking Evenki or Evan or Udege marked you as backward, rural, uneducated. The Soviet government did create written forms for some Tungusic languages in the 1930s, first using Latin alphabet and then Cyrillic. Schools were established where children received at least some education in their native languages. But these efforts were half-hearted and frequently undermined by the overwhelming dominance of Russian in every sphere that mattered. Collectivization proved particularly devastating for northern Tungusic peoples who had maintained reindeer herding as their traditional livelihood. The Soviet state forced nomadic Evenki and Evan communities to settle in permanent villages, breaking up the seasonal migration patterns that had structured their lives for centuries. Children were sent to boarding schools where Russian was the language of instruction, and speaking Evenki or Evan was often actively discouraged or punished. When these children returned to their villages, they had lost fluency in their ancestral language. They married Russian speakers or other assimilated indigenous people. Their own children grew up hearing Russian at home and had almost no exposure to Evenki or Evan.
In China, the mechanisms of language shift operated differently but with similar results. Chinese was the language of power, education, and opportunity. Schools taught in Chinese. The government bureaucracy operated in Chinese. Television broadcasts and popular culture came in Chinese. For a Tungusic child growing up in northeastern China, learning Chinese fluently was absolutely essential for any hope of success. Learning Hejian or Oroken offered no practical benefit whatsoever. The National College Entrance Examination was administered entirely in Chinese. Students who wanted to attend good universities needed near-perfect fluency in Chinese and deep familiarity with Chinese cultural references. A few hours a week studying minority languages could not compete with the thousands of hours spent mastering Chinese. Linguists and anthropologists who recognized the scale of this crisis began racing against time to document Tungusic languages before the last speakers died. These fieldwork projects often had a desperate, melancholy quality. Researchers would travel to remote villages hoping to find elderly speakers, only to discover that the few people who had known the language had died since the last census or had become too ill to be interviewed.
The story of Alexander Conchuga and the Udege language offers a remarkable example of what successful documentation could achieve. Conchuga, born in 1935 in the Primorsky region of Russia, was a member of the Udege people who had worked as a Russian language and literature teacher. When Toshiro Tsumagarin met him during fieldwork in the 1990s, Conchuga was one of the few Udege who were both fluent in the language and capable of writing it down. Tsumagari asked Conchuga to produce some simple texts in Udege for linguistic analysis. Instead, Conchuga began writing down his memories of childhood, producing a remarkable autobiography that described traditional Udege life before Soviet collectivization. The autobiography, titled On the Banks of the Bikin River, described Conchuga's youth in the 1930s and 40s when the Udege still lived by hunting, fishing, and gathering in the forests of the Sikote-Alan Mountains. He wrote about the traditional wooden houses his people built, the birch bark boats they used to navigate forest streams, the elaborate fish traps that caught salmon during spawning runs. He described shamanic ceremonies, seasonal migrations following game animals, and the complex social rules that governed Udege life. Most importantly, he wrote all of this in the Udege language, producing a text of extraordinary linguistic and ethnographic value.
Conchuga wrote in both Udege and Russian, creating a parallel text that allowed readers to understand the Udege original. Tsumogari eventually published this work with Japanese translation, creating a trilingual document that made Udege accessible to international scholarship. Parts of the autobiography were later converted into illustrated children's books, with CDs providing pronunciation guides, offering tools that could help transmit the language to new generations.
Here was proof that Udege was not just a collection of words and grammar rules, but a living medium capable of expressing complex thoughts, preserving cultural memory, and connecting generations. Yet even Kanshuga's success highlighted the fragility of the situation. At the time he wrote his autobiography, Kanshuga was already in his 60s, among the younger fluent speakers. Most Udege who still spoke the language were even older. The children in Udege villages spoke Russian almost exclusively. After years of intensive study, Tsumogari himself admitted that he still did not fully understand all the linguistic nuances of Kanshuga's text. The autobiography was likely to remain one of the only substantial texts ever written in Udege, a memorial to a language that would almost certainly be extinct within a generation or two.
The loss of these languages meant more than the loss of words. Tungusic languages had developed over thousands of years specialized vocabularies for their traditional environments and ways of life. The Evenki had dozens of words for different types of snow and ice conditions, distinctions that were crucial for winter travel in the boreal forests, but that had no equivalents in Russian. They could describe whether snow was fresh powder, wind-packed crust, melting slush, or any of dozens of other conditions, each with implications for how reindeer would move and how hunters could track game. When Russian became the dominant language, this entire system of environmental knowledge encoded in vocabulary began to disappear. The Evenki also possessed complex terminology for different ages and conditions of reindeer. A language that had developed around reindeer herding for thousands of years had words that distinguished calves from yearlings from mature animals, that described reindeer by the condition of their antlers, by their coloring patterns, by their temperaments, by their suitability for riding versus packing versus milk production. This vocabulary represented accumulated wisdom about the animals that were central to Evenki life. When children stopped learning these words because they no longer herded reindeer, they lost access to knowledge their ancestors had spent millennia developing. When children stopped learning these words because they no longer herded reindeer, they lost access to knowledge their ancestors had spent millennia developing.
Evenki hunting culture embodied a sophisticated ethical code that was transmitted through language and practice. Hunters learned never to kill pregnant animals, never to take more game than they needed, never to show excessive joy or pride after a successful hunt. In group hunts, the most skilled hunters had the right to shoot first. These rules reflected deep cultural values about humans' proper relationship with the natural world and with each other. They were not written down, but rather transmitted orally through stories, through instruction from elders, through the very language used to talk about hunting. When hunting itself became illegal or impractical, and when the language that carried these teachings disappeared, an entire ethical framework dissolved. The Evenki also possessed detailed knowledge of forest plants and their seasonal cycles. They knew which plants were edible and when they could be safely gathered. They knew which plants had medicinal properties and how to prepare them. They knew which plants appeared in which environments and what their presence indicated about soil conditions, water availability, and the movements of game animals. This botanical knowledge, accumulated over countless generations living in the boreal forests, existed primarily in oral tradition and in the vocabulary used to describe plants and their uses. A Russian-speaking Evenki child growing up in a settled village would never acquire this knowledge because the contexts in which it had meaning no longer existed. Historical sources describe the 17th century Evenki as simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, with population densities of perhaps 1 person per 25 square kilometers across vast territories of Siberia. This extremely dispersed settlement pattern reflected an adaptation to an environment where resources were scattered and mobility was essential for survival. The knowledge systems encoded in Evenki language and culture had developed in this context, creating ways of thinking about territory, resources, and social relationships that differed fundamentally from those of settled agricultural peoples. Tungusic languages also preserved sophisticated grammatical systems that reflected cultural values and ways of understanding the world. Many had structures that marked whether something could be alienated from its owner or was inalienably possessed, a distinction that reflected deep cultural values about the relationship between people and property. They had complex systems of evidentiality, grammatical markers that indicated whether the speaker had witnessed something directly or learned of it secondhand, reflecting cultural emphasis on the sources of knowledge. When children stopped learning these languages, they stopped inheriting these ways of thinking about the world. The urgency of documentation became even more acute when researchers realized that different Tungusic languages were being lost at different rates, and that the diversity within the language family was greater than previously understood. The category Evenki language actually encompassed numerous dialects that were sometimes barely mutually intelligible. The Solon Evenki of northeastern China spoke quite differently from the Orochen, who in turn differed from the Evenki of central Siberia. Yet research had focused on standard dialects, while marginal varieties remained undocumented. When a speaker of one of these marginal dialects died, an entire variant of the language could disappear without anyone having recorded its distinctive features. Linguists argued that Tungusic languages possessed complexity and expressive power equal to English or Japanese or any other major world language, despite having far fewer speakers. These were languages with thousands of years of history, languages that had evolved sophisticated grammatical systems and rich vocabularies adequate for expressing any thought or feeling. The fact that they were spoken by small populations did not make them linguistically inferior or less worthy of preservation. Yet this intellectual argument carried little weight against the practical reality that learning Russian or Chinese offered concrete advantages, while learning Evenki or Hessian offered none. By the early 21st century, multiple Tungusic languages were down to their last handful of fluent elderly speakers. Researchers who wanted to document these languages had perhaps a 5 or 10-year window before the last speakers would be too old or too ill to work with. Every year of delay meant more knowledge lost, more nuances of grammar and vocabulary that would never be recorded. The race to document was literally a race against death, as researchers tried to capture as much as possible before their consultants passed away. What would remain when the last speaker of Hezen or Orochi died? There would be grammars, dictionaries, recorded texts, perhaps even some video documentation of the languages being spoken. But these would be museum pieces, like stuffed animals in natural history collections. The languages would no longer evolve, no longer adapt to new circumstances, no longer serve as vehicles for human thought and creativity. The thousands of years of accumulated wisdom about how to live in the forests and rivers of northeastern Asia, wisdom encoded in vocabularies and grammatical structures that reflected deep understanding of the natural world, would be reduced to files in archives, accessible only to specialists who studied dead languages. The children and grandchildren of the last speakers would grow up knowing their ancestry, but unable to access it directly through language. They might feel a sense of loss, might seek to reclaim something of what had been taken from their families. But that reclamation would necessarily be incomplete, mediated through Russian or Chinese, filtered through the assumptions and categories of dominant cultures. They would be Evenki or Udege or Hessian in name and official classification, but not in the most fundamental sense of thinking and speaking in the language of their ancestors. The story of Tungusic language death thus stood as a warning about the fragility of linguistic and cultural diversity in the modern world. Within a few decades, the vast linguistic diversity of Tungusic peoples would be reduced to a handful of languages, maintained as school subjects, and everything else consigned to archives and memories. Chapter 5. Protected into Extinction. In the early 1950s, teams of ethnologists and linguists fanned out across China's vast borderlands on a mission that would fundamentally shape how millions of people understood their own identities. The new communist government had committed itself to recognizing and protecting China's ethnic minorities, but first it needed to determine who these minorities were. This project of ethnic identification, known as the Minzu Shibi, took years to complete and involved countless interviews, linguistic surveys, and bureaucratic deliberations. When the process concluded, the government had officially recognized 55 minority nationalities alongside the dominant Han Chinese. Among these 55 were 5 groups classified as Tungusic peoples: the Manchu, Sibe, Evenki, Oroken, and Hessian. This official recognition brought real benefits to Tungusic communities. They were granted autonomous areas where they theoretically enjoyed self-governance. They received exemptions from the one-child policy that restricted Han Chinese families. They had reserved positions in universities and government offices. Their cultures were celebrated in official rhetoric as precious contributions to China's diverse heritage. Yet decades later, despite these protections and privileges, Tungusic languages were dying, traditional practices were fading, and young people increasingly identified as Tungusic only in the formal bureaucratic sense of having the designation stamped on their residence permits. The very policies designed to protect minority nationalities had somehow facilitated their cultural erosion. The 5 Tungusic groups recognized by the Chinese government varied enormously in size and circumstances. The Manchu, by far the largest, numbered over 10 million according to the 2010 census, making them China's second largest minority nationality. The Evenki, numbering around 30,000, lived primarily in Inner Mongolia's forests and grasslands. The Oroken, fewer than 7,000 strong, inhabited the greater Hingan mountain range. The Sibe, about 170,000, were concentrated in Liaoning province and Xinjiang's Ili Valley. The Hessian, the smallest group at just over 4,000, lived along the Heilongjiang and Ussuri rivers in China's far northeast. The government created a network of autonomous administrative units for these groups. The Evenki Autonomous Banner in Inner Mongolia, established in 1958, covered an area the size of Taiwan, but was home to barely 30,000 people of all ethnicities. Within this banner, ethnic Evenki comprised perhaps only a third of the population, with Han Chinese and Mongols making up the rest. The Oroken Autonomous Banner, created in 1951, followed a similar pattern. For the Hessian, who were too few and too scattered to have their own county, the government created ethnic townships, small administrative units, where Hessian theoretically had some degree of local control. The Sibe were unique among Tungusic peoples in having an autonomous county in Xinjiang, the Kapkal Sibe Autonomous County, established in 1954. These autonomous areas provided a framework for preserving Tungusic cultures, but the reality on the ground often diverged sharply from the theory. In the Evenki Autonomous Banner, government business was conducted almost entirely in Chinese. Schools taught in Chinese with perhaps a few hours a week of Evenki language instruction. The banner's leadership positions, while nominally reserved for Evenki, were often held by Communist Party members whose primary qualification was political reliability rather than cultural knowledge or language fluency. The autonomy was largely symbolic, with real power concentrated in the hands of the party apparatus that took its orders from Beijing. The population statistics revealed a profound paradox. According to census data, the number of people identifying as members of Tungusic minority nationalities had grown dramatically over recent decades. The Manchu population increased from about 4 million in 1982 to over 10 million by 2010. The Evenki nearly doubled from around 19,000 to over 30,000. The tiny Hessian population grew from about 1,500 to over 4,000. Yet during the same period, as documented in Chapter 4, the number of people who could actually speak these groups' languages had collapsed to a tiny fraction of ethnic populations. Chinese census data from 1990 starkly illustrated this disconnect. The Evenki ethnic population stood at 26,315, yet only 17,000 could speak the language. Among the Oroken, 6,965 people claimed ethnic identity, while only 2,240 spoke the language. The Hessian showed the most dramatic gap: 4,245 ethnic Hessian, but merely 40 speakers.
Most shocking was the Manchu case. Nearly 10 million people identified ethnically as Manchu in 2000, yet perhaps only 70 individuals could still speak the language. This population paradox reflected the incentive structure created by China's minority nationality policies. Being classified as a minority carried concrete advantages: exemption from family planning restrictions, bonus points on the college entrance examination, preferential treatment in government hiring. When the government began enforcing the one-child policy rigorously in the 1980s, Han Chinese couples who could claim minority status for their children suddenly had powerful motivation to emphasize previously downplayed Tungusic ancestry. A child registered as Evenki or Oroken could more easily gain admission to universities, qualify for government jobs, and enjoy other benefits that Han Chinese children could not access. The result was a peculiar phenomenon where ethnic identity became increasingly divorced from cultural content. In cities like Harbin or Holun-Buyur, young people with Evenki or Oroken designations on their identity cards lived lives indistinguishable from their Han Chinese classmates. They spoke only Mandarin, ate the same foods, wore the same clothes, consumed the same media, and aspired to the same careers. Their ethnic identity existed primarily as a bureaucratic category that occasionally provided tangible benefits, but carried little meaning in terms of how they actually lived their daily lives. Educational policy embodied the fundamental contradiction at the heart of China's approach to minority nationalities. The government established schools in minority areas and required some instruction in minority languages and cultures. In the Evenki Autonomous Banner, elementary schools offered Evenki language classes, and the local government published textbooks in Evenki using a Cyrillic-based script developed during the Soviet period. In Hessian townships, efforts were made to teach at least some basic Hessian vocabulary to children who had grown up speaking only Chinese. These programs could point to real achievements: thousands of minority students exposed to their ancestral languages, cultural knowledge transmitted across generations, and communities given tools to resist complete assimilation. Yet the same educational system overwhelmingly prioritized Chinese language and Han culture. The National College Entrance Examination, the Gaokao, was administered entirely in Chinese and tested knowledge of Chinese literature, history, and culture. Students who wanted to attend good universities and pursue professional careers needed near-perfect fluency in Chinese and deep familiarity with Chinese cultural references. A few hours a week studying Evenki or Hessian could not compete with the thousands of hours spent mastering Chinese. Parents who cared about their children's futures rationally emphasized Chinese education, even when they valued their own cultural heritage. The message received by minority children was clear: your ethnic identity may be officially celebrated, but Chinese language and culture are what actually matter. The case of the Eolugia Evenki illustrated how modernization policies could devastate traditional cultures even while officially protecting them. The Eolugia Evenki, numbering barely a few hundred people, were the last reindeer herders in China, living deep in the Greater Khingan Mountains and maintaining a lifestyle that had changed little for centuries. They followed their reindeer herds through seasonal migrations, living in traditional conical tents and sustaining themselves through hunting, gathering, and the products of their animals. In 2003, the government decided that this nomadic lifestyle was incompatible with modernity and environmental protection. Officials relocated the Eolugia Evenki to a new settlement, built permanent housing for them, and banned the hunting that had been central to their economy and identity. The relocation was presented as being for the Evenki's own good. The new settlement had schools, a clinic, electricity, and running water, amenities that the Evenki had lacked in their forest camps. Government officials spoke of lifting the Evenki out of poverty and giving them access to modern civilization. Yet the relocation shattered the traditional lifestyle that had sustained Evenki identity for generations. Unable to hunt, separated from the forest environment where their cultural knowledge had meaning, the Eolugia Evenki fell into a kind of limbo. Alcoholism and social problems increased. Young people drifted to cities seeking work, never to return. The reindeer herds, no longer needed for transportation or sustenance, dwindled or became tourist attractions. Recognizing the cultural disaster that relocation had caused, the government eventually allowed some Iolugia evenki to return to the forests with their reindeer. But this return to tradition was itself highly managed and constrained. The evenki could no longer hunt freely, but had to obtain permits for limited subsistence hunting. Their traditional territories had been incorporated into nature reserves with access restrictions. Most significantly, the younger generation had grown up in the settlement town and lacked the knowledge and skills needed for forest life. The few families who returned to traditional herding were increasingly elderly, and it was unclear whether anyone would continue the practice once they were gone. Tourism emerged as both an opportunity and a threat for Tungusic communities. The Chinese government promoted ethnic tourism as a way to develop minority regions economically while preserving cultural heritage. In the Evenki Autonomous banner, reindeer herding became a tourist attraction, with visitors paying to photograph Evenki in traditional clothing with their reindeer. Tour operators arranged for urban Chinese tourists to spend nights in replica traditional tents, eat authentic Evenki meals, and watch demonstrations of reindeer handling. The Orokan Autonomous banner developed cultural tourism based on traditional hunting culture and forest life, offering tourists the chance to try archery and see displays of hunting equipment. Heijin communities along the rivers began offering demonstrations of fish skin clothing production and traditional fishing techniques. This tourism brought money into poor communities and created at least some incentive to maintain traditional practices. Yet cultural tourism also distorted and commodified the very traditions it claimed to preserve. The Evenki, who posed for tourist photographs, were often not traditional herders, but people hired to dress in traditional clothing and perform an ethnic identity for cameras. The traditional practices demonstrated for tourists were reconstructions based on historical records rather than living traditions passed down through generations. The reindeer, once integral to Evenki life, became props in a cultural performance staged for urban Chinese tourists seeking authentic ethnic experiences. Young people might learn traditional crafts not because these skills had practical value or cultural meaning, but because they could earn money performing them for tourists. The line between cultural preservation and cultural theme park became increasingly difficult to discern. Environmental policies created another arena where official protection and actual impact diverged. The Chinese government designated large areas of the Greater Khingan and Lesser Khingan Mountains as nature reserves, ostensibly to protect the forests and wildlife that were crucial to Tungusic cultural identity. Logging was banned or severely restricted in these areas. Hunting was prohibited or tightly controlled. These policies had legitimate environmental benefits, helping to preserve forests and wildlife populations that had been decimated by industrial exploitation. However, these same policies made it almost impossible for Tungusic peoples to continue traditional hunting and gathering practices that had been central to their identities for thousands of years. The Evenki and Oroken, whose cultures had developed around hunting, now faced criminal penalties if they took game without permits. The detailed knowledge of animal behavior, seasonal patterns, and forest ecology that elders possessed had no practical application when hunting itself was illegal. Young people had no incentive to learn traditional skills that they would never be allowed to use. The result was that environmental protection, whatever its ecological merits, severed the connection between Tungusic peoples and the land that had shaped their cultures. The few Tungusic activists and intellectuals who tried to preserve their cultures faced daunting obstacles. Any attempt to organize around ethnic identity risked being labeled as separatist or subversive, charges that could bring severe punishment in China's political environment. The government tolerated and even encouraged cultural preservation activities as long as they remained strictly apolitical and did not challenge the fundamental premise of Chinese unity and Communist Party leadership.
This meant that Tungusic cultural advocates could publish dictionaries, teach language classes, and organize cultural festivals, but they could not build the kind of political movements that might create real autonomy or resist assimilation pressures. The fundamental contradiction was that official recognition of minority nationality status created categories and structures that persisted even as cultural content disappeared. By classifying millions of people as Manchu or Evenki or Hessian, the government created identity categories that could outlast the living cultures they supposedly represented. Someone could be officially Manchu while speaking only Chinese, practicing no Manchu customs, and having no connection to Manchu culture beyond distant ancestry. The bureaucratic category became a substitute for cultural reality. By the early 21st century, Tungusic communities in China found themselves navigating a complex terrain where their ethnic identities were simultaneously recognized and eroded, protected and undermined, celebrated and destroyed. The government's minority nationality policies had created structures that ensured Tungusic peoples would not simply disappear from official records and statistics. Yet, these same policies had failed to address the fundamental economic, educational, and social pressures driving assimilation into Han Chinese culture. Museums displayed beautiful examples of Evenki clothing and tools, but living Evenki communities were prevented from hunting and forced into settlements. Schools taught Hessian vocabulary during special cultural classes, but conducted all real instruction in Chinese. Local governments sponsored festivals celebrating Orokan traditions, but the younger generation had long since abandoned traditional practices for urban lifestyles and Chinese cultural norms. The result was a population of millions officially classified as Tungusic, but increasingly Tungusic in name only, their languages dying, their traditional practices fading, their distinctive cultures reduced to museum exhibits and tourist performances rather than living realities passed from one generation to the next. The story of the Tungusic peoples reveals a profound irony. Those who conquered empires were themselves conquered by success, and those granted official protection have been protected into near extinction. From the ancient Sushen to the Manchu rulers of China, to the last speakers of dying languages, we've traced a journey spanning thousands of years and millions of square miles. What we've witnessed is not simply the rise and fall of dynasties or the natural evolution of cultures, but rather a case study in how linguistic and cultural diversity can vanish even amid official recognition and legal protection. The Tungusic experience asks us to consider what is truly lost when a language dies, when a way of life becomes a museum exhibit, when millions carry an ethnic designation emptied of cultural meaning. Perhaps the deepest lesson is this: identity cannot be preserved through bureaucratic categories alone. It lives only in daily practice, in language spoken, in knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Thank you for listening.